In old Hollywood, it was all about the image. Perfect hair, perfect smiles, perfect lives, or at least that's what they wanted you to believe. But behind the photo shoots and press junkets were real people dealing with things no one talked about. Pain that didn't make headlines. Families that looked picture perfect from the outside, but were falling apart in private. Some of these stories were buried for decades, others were whispered about, and quickly forgotten. There were secrets hidden behind stage doors, studio contracts, and tight-lipped PR teams. And in the middle of it all were actors just trying to survive, some barely holding on, some pushed past their breaking point by the very system that made them stars. These aren't dramatic scandals for the sake of gossip. These are the stories that never got told loud enough, the ones that show what really went on when the cameras weren't rolling. Susan Cabot, A Castle Made of Silence. In the 1950s, Susan Cabot was a regular in the low-budget corners of Hollywood, often cast as women lost in surreal, nightmarish worlds. The irony was cruel. Off-screen, her real life became stranger, lonelier, and far more heartbreaking than anything written in those scripts. She wasn't born into safety. Her early years were marked by instability, shuffled through foster homes that left more questions than comfort. Acting offered her a way out, a place where she could create something lasting, even if the spotlight wasn't always kind. Her performances were never loud, but they stuck with you. There was always something behind her eyes that felt unsaid. As the roles dried up, so did her ties to the world outside. She withdrew from Hollywood, then from people altogether. Inside a modest Los Angeles home, she lived with her son, Timothy, just the two of them, bound together in a life that grew more isolated with each passing year. He had health complications and a childhood marked by secrecy, government medical treatments, and overwhelming responsibility, far too young. By 1986, everything had unraveled. During an argument in their home, her son struck her fatally. The details were messy, confusing, and to many unthinkable. He was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Some called it a tragic accident. Others saw it as the inevitable end of a long, unraveling silence. What's most haunting isn't the final moment, it's everything that led there. A woman who spent her life being overlooked, then forgotten. A family living behind drawn curtains, both of them fading in their own way. The headlines came and went, focusing on the act, not the years of loneliness, confusion, and quiet desperation that built up to it. Susan Cabot didn't just disappear from Hollywood, she vanished from the world. And when it finally noticed her again, it was far too late. Frances Farmer. Too honest for the script. Frances Farmer didn't just act, she pushed back. In an era when women were expected to smile, stay agreeable, and speak only when spoken to, Frances showed up quoting Nietzsche and questioning everything. She won awards, landed roles with A-list co-stars, and made headlines before she ever wanted them. But from the start, the industry didn't quite know what to do with her. She didn't play the game, and Hollywood has never been kind to people who don't play the game. At first, they called her difficult. Then troubled. Eventually, they stopped calling her at all. She was smart, blunt, and didn't hide her anger when she felt boxed in. She refused to live on someone else's terms, including her family's. That might sound admirable now, but back then it wasn't seen as strength, it was seen as a problem to be fixed. So they tried to fix her. Her mother, once supportive, slowly became more of a gatekeeper than a guardian. When Frances began unraveling, whether from pressure, mental health struggles, or just exhaustion, her family didn't protect her. They signed the papers. The kind that turned a once rising star into a long-term patient at a state institution. Years of her life went missing behind locked doors. What happened inside was never fully confirmed, but the truth was probably worse than anything in the rumors. What's known is that she came out quieter. Not broken, but different. Like someone who had finally learned that the world doesn't reward defiance, it punishes it. She eventually returned to the public eye. Smaller roles, a memoir, late-night interviews where she smiled but never gave everything away. By then, the damage had already been done. Not just to her career, but to her spirit. Frances Farmer wasn't ruined by Hollywood or by madness. She was worn down by a world that couldn't accept a woman who wouldn't stay in her place, and by a family that, when it mattered most, stopped trying to understand her. Barbara Payton. The fall wasn't sudden, it was ignored. There was a moment not long after she arrived in Hollywood when Barbara Payton seemed untouchable. Platinum blonde, sharp-witted, with a face built for close-ups and a confidence that didn't ask permission. She wasn't trying to be America's sweetheart. She wanted to be wanted, and she knew she was. The camera loved her. The press followed her. The industry took what it wanted from her, and for a while, she gave it willingly. Then it took more. Her personal life spilled out into tabloids, but what didn't make the headlines was what was happening behind closed doors, long before her name stopped showing up on movie posters. She didn't disappear all at once. It happened slowly. One role lost, one bad headline, one burned bridge at a time. But the cameras kept flashing, even as the lights in her life started to go out. There were two men, both actors, who fought over her in the streets. One walked away with a bruised face, the other with a bruised career. Barbara, caught between them, became less of a person and more of spectacle. The love triangle became legend. The work offers dried up. People stopped seeing her as a performer and started seeing her as a problem. That's how it works in Hollywood. If you fall quietly, no one notices. If you fall loudly, they sell tickets. She had a son. That part gets left out sometimes. A boy who watched his mother go from movie sets to motel rooms. Her family stayed silent for the most part. When help came, it came too late and not often. She wrote a memoir near the end, as honest as it was sad, like a letter from someone already halfway gone. Barbara Payton didn't vanish. She was simply left behind. One of those stories people shrug off with phrases like, "what a waste," or "she had all." But she didn't. Not really. What she had was just enough to make people look, and not enough to make them stay. Jean Seberg. The cost of being seen. Jean Seberg had the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention. It simply held it. She was young when she was chosen out of nowhere to star in St. Joan, and even younger when the critics decided she wasn't what they wanted her to be. Most actors get to fail in private. Jean's missteps were printed, published, and picked apart before she ever found her footing. But didn't stop her. She moved to France, found a second wind, and became something else entirely, the face of Breathless, the muse of the French New Wave, a quiet force with wide eyes and a voice that always sounded like it knew more than it said. She never quite belonged to Hollywood, and maybe that's what made her dangerous to the people who kept track of such things. Back in the US, her personal life didn't stay personal for long. Her politics weren't radical, but they were vocal. She supported people the government preferred to keep in margins. She donated, she spoke up, she refused to play it safe. And that was enough. They watched her. They followed her. And then they started writing the story for her, publishing lies, planting whispers. When the press ran with the headlines, she didn't get to correct the record. No one does when the machine decides who you are. One of those lies involved her pregnancy. They turned it into a question mark, then into a weapon. The stress took something from her that no apology could ever return. Her family tried to protect her, but even they couldn't fight back against something so massive and invisible. Jean kept working, but the weight never really lifted. The spotlight had turned cold. Her legacy now is tied to both her talent and her silence, not the silence she chose, but the one she was forced into. She wasn't destroyed by scandal or failure. She was worn down by being watched, misread, and used as a symbol for a fight she never started. And by the time people tried to listen, it was already too late. George Reeves, the man who was supposed to fly. For children in the 1950s, George Reeves was larger than life. He wore the cape, struck the pose, and became Superman at a time when television felt almost magical. To a generation of families gathered around black and white screens, he wasn't an actor playing a part, he was the hero. The one who couldn't be hurt, who always did the right thing, who soared above the rest of us. But George Reeves was human, and being human doesn't fit well inside a costume built for perfection. He had trained for a serious career, supporting roles in films like Gone with the Wind, then years of hard work in smaller productions. When Superman came along, it gave him the kind of fame actors dream about, but it also trapped him. Casting directors stopped seeing George. They only saw the cape. When he wanted to branch out, Hollywood shrugged. Superman was good for TV, but not, they thought, for cinema. Behind the public adoration, his private world was more complicated. His relationships were tangled, especially one with a married woman whose husband held serious influence in Hollywood. It brought him comfort, but also tension, the kind of situation where too many people had too much to lose. In June 1959, everything stopped. He was found in his bedroom with a single gunshot wound. Officially, it was called a self-inflicted death. But almost immediately, doubts surfaced. The scene didn't add up. Friends didn't believe it. And whispers began about lovers, about jealousy, about powerful men who could make problems disappear. His family was left with more questions than answers. Fans were left with heartbreak. The children who idolized him had to learn all at once that their hero was gone, and maybe not in the way they were told. George Reeves's story isn't about a man who could fly. It's about a man who carried the impossible weight of being seen as indestructible, when in truth, he was as vulnerable as the rest of us. Ramon Novarro, a star in two worlds. In the 1920s, Ramon Novarro was a name spoken with awe. He had charm, talent, and the kind of screen presence that made audiences believe in myths and legends. When he starred in Ben-Hur, he wasn't just playing a role. He became a symbol of Hollywood's golden promise that you could be larger than life, immortalized on screen, forever adored. But off-screen, Ramon was living in two worlds. To the public, he was the perfect leading man, dashing and untouchable. To those close to him, he was more complicated, a man torn between his faith, his family's expectations, and desires that society told him to keep hidden. Hollywood loved his looks, but it wouldn't allow him the freedom to be himself. So he learned to live carefully, to perform not just on film, but in everyday life. The spotlight faded with time. He aged as all stars do, and the calls from the studios grew fewer. Yet he never fully disappeared. He stayed in his home, surrounded by reminders of his once glittering career, carrying the weight of both adoration and isolation. His family, devout and traditional, never gave him the understanding he needed. That kind of honesty wasn't welcome then. Not in Hollywood. Not in most homes. In 1968, his story ended violently. Two young men he had invited into his home turned on him. What they did was cruel, senseless, and final. Newspapers rushed to print lurid details, stripping away dignity from a man who had already spent his life walking carefully around secrets. To the public, it was a scandal. To his family, it was shame. To those who looked closer, it was the tragic end of a man who had been forced to live too many different lives at once. Ramon Novarro's story isn't just about the end. It's about the quiet suffering of a man who gave everything to the screen, only to be left with silence when the curtain fell. A star who shone bright, but in the shadows, never truly belonged. Dorothy Dandridge, a spotlight with shadows. Dorothy Dandridge had the kind of beauty that left people silent for a moment before they found their words again. When she walked into a room, heads turned. When she stepped on stage, every eye followed. Hollywood couldn't deny her talent, but it never fully gave her the freedom it handed to others. She broke barriers just by standing where she did, and that came with both applause and punishment. Her career soared in the 1950s. She was nominated for an Academy Award, gracing magazine covers and performing in packed clubs where the spotlight loved her. To the outside world, she looked like a woman who had it all: elegance, fame, and a future that seemed limitless. But behind that polished image, Dorothy's life was tangled in ways most never saw. She was a mother first, and that part of her story rarely made it into the glossy profiles. Her daughter, Carolyn, was born with lifelong medical challenges that required constant care. Dorothy loved her fiercely, but the weight was immense. Raising her child while balancing a demanding career and relentless financial strain left Dorothy exhausted, stretched between two worlds. She adored her daughter, yet she carried the guilt of knowing she couldn't always give her the care she deserved. Much of that burden fell on institutions when Dorothy had no other choice, and that decision haunted her. Her personal relationships offered little relief. Men promised her the world, but too often left her with betrayal, debts, or disappointment. Hollywood dangled opportunities, then pulled them away the moment she asked for equality or respect. She lived in a world that wanted her beauty, but didn't want her voice. Dorothy's life was a mixture of milestones and heartbreaks. She lit up stages and screens, showing what was possible, even while privately carrying pain few ever knew about. To audiences, she was radiant. To herself, she was often alone, fighting battles no award could ease. Dorothy Dandridge opened doors for countless others, but she paid the price in silence, carrying the shadows of her private world until the end. Lupe Vallès. Larger than the stage, Lupe Vallès was never quiet. On screen, she was a whirlwind, sharp, funny, unpredictable, the kind of presence you couldn't ignore. Off-screen, she was just as bold. In a Hollywood that often preferred its women soft-spoken and submissive, Lupe was loud, unafraid, and unwilling to shrink herself for anyone. She was nicknamed the Mexican Spitfire, and for years, audiences adored her for it. But there's a difference between being admired and being understood. Lupe came from Mexico and broke through in Hollywood during a time when the industry wasn't welcoming to outsiders. Studios played up her accent, cast her in roles that exaggerated stereotypes, and often treated her as a novelty rather than the versatile actress she really was. She leaned into the roles because they kept her working, but privately, she longed for something more than being typecast as a fiery caricature. Her personal life was no less dramatic than the films she made. She loved passionately, argued passionately, and lived without restraint. But behind that boldness was someone deeply vulnerable. She wanted stability, a family, a future built on something real, rather than Hollywood make-believe. In the final year of her life, things grew complicated. She discovered she was pregnant, and instead of celebrating, she faced judgment, rejection, and fear. In an industry where image was everything, and in a society that judged women harshly, she felt cornered. The public didn't know this side of her. They only saw the bright star who laughed loudly and lit up every room. When her life ended in 1944, the news was cruel. Instead of compassion, the press twisted her story into a joke, spreading tasteless myths about her final moments. For decades, those lies overshadowed the truth that she was a woman who loved fiercely, fought for her place in an industry that kept her boxed in, and carried private heartbreak the public never saw. Lupe Valles was larger than the stage, larger than the screen, but in the end, Hollywood made her story smaller, remembered for the spectacle rather than the spirit. Peg Entwistle, the girl on the sign. Peg Entwistle's name might not ring as loudly as others from Hollywood's golden era, but her story is carved into the city itself. Born in Wales, raised in America, she dreamed bigger than the small towns she passed through. Acting wasn't just a career choice for Peg, it was the thing she believed could lift her into another world entirely. She was good, too. On stage in New York, she earned strong reviews, enough to make the leap west where movies promised bigger opportunities. The 1930s were a brutal time to chase fame, though. The Depression had drained the country, studios were tightening budgets, and competition was ruthless. For every star who found a place, hundreds disappeared into bit parts or vanished entirely. Peg got a role in 13 Women, a thriller that put her face on screen but didn't open many doors afterward. The industry was already moving on, always chasing the next face, the next novelty. Work slowed, confidence cracked. She was young, far from home, and living in a city that chewed up dreams as fast as it handed them out. In September 1932, she climbed the hill to the Hollywoodland sign, still new then, a glittering symbol of promise perched above the city. She didn't see promise anymore. From that height, the lights of Los Angeles spread below her, glowing with opportunity she felt was no longer hers. That night, she made a decision that would etch her into Hollywood's mythology forever. The letter offering her a major role arrived too late. It was a kind of part that could have changed everything. Instead, her name became attached to sign, her story retold in whispers as a cautionary tale. Peg Entwistle didn't live long enough to see what she might have become. But in a strange, haunting way, she achieved what she longed for, to be remembered. Not just as the girl on the sign, but as a symbol of how fragile dreams can be and how heavy the silence feels when the world stops listening. Gail Russell, the star who couldn't speak up. Gail Russell never really wanted to be a star. She was painfully shy, the kind of young woman who froze at parties, who dreaded being the center of attention. But in Hollywood, sometimes all it took was a face. She had one that studios adored, delicate, almost ethereal, with eyes that seemed to hold every emotion at once. Paramount signed her at 17, confident they could turn her into their next big discovery. The truth was, Gail wasn't ready for what they gave her. Acting terrified her. She hated auditions, hated cameras, hated the expectation to perform on command. But she did as she was told, and the films kept coming. She stood opposite John Wayne in Angel and the Bad Man, appeared in glossy romances and thrillers, all while quietly dreading every day on set. Her family offered little refuge. She was their success story, the one who made it to Hollywood. That kind of pressure doesn't leave much room for weakness. To cope, she turned to the one thing that made the fear fade: a drink before walking on set, a drink before facing a crowd. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. But in Hollywood, survival strategies quickly turn into weapons against you. Producers complained she was unreliable. Co-stars whispered. Studio executives decided she was difficult, when really, she was just terrified. The work slowed, the contracts ended, and the quiet girl who never wanted to be a star was left without the career that had defined her life. Neighbors later remembered her as sweet but reclusive, someone who lived more with memories than with people. By her late 30s, she had retreated almost completely from the world. When she died, alone in her apartment, the papers mentioned the bottle beside her before they mentioned her films. Gail Russell's story isn't about scandal or spectacle. It's about a young woman who was given fame she never asked for and who carried the weight of it until it crushed her. She was proof that sometimes the screen doesn't reflect a person's strength, it reflects their silence. Lila Leeds, the one left holding the blame. Lila Leeds came to Hollywood with the kind of look casting directors loved, tall, blonde, and photogenic in a way that seemed almost designed for the camera. She was never groomed to be a great dramatic actress, but she didn't need to be. Studios saw her as the type who could decorate a set, sell tickets, and smile at premieres. For a while it worked. Her face appeared in magazines, her name in gossip columns. She was on her way. Then came the night that changed everything. In 1948, Lila was arrested in a private home alongside Robert Mitchum, one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. Police had raided the place, and both were caught up in the fallout. On paper, the charges were the same. In reality, the outcomes couldn't have been more different. Mitchum went to court, served his time, and emerged with his career somehow stronger than before. For him, the scandal became part of his tough guy legend. For Lila, it was the end. The studios closed their doors. Casting agents stopped calling. She was branded as the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when a starlet steps out of line. She wasn't forgiven or mythologized, she was discarded. All the promise, all the grooming, all the publicity evaporated overnight. Hollywood had chosen who would be spared and who would be sacrificed. Her family life was strained, her support system thin. She drifted further from the spotlight and deeper into shadows, carrying the weight of a mistake that had defined her more than any performance she ever gave. Years later, she tried to rebuild, even becoming a minister, speaking to others about her struggles. But the industry never let her back in. Lila Leeds' story isn't just about one night. It's about the double standards that decided which lives were worth salvaging and which could be thrown away. In the end, she wasn't remembered for her talent or her beauty, but for being the one left holding the blame while the man beside her walked away with legend status. Marie Prevost, forgotten while the lights still burned. Marie Prevost was once one of Hollywood's brightest names. She was part of Max Sennett's famous Bathing Beauties, later transitioning into respected roles during the silent era. Audiences adored her for her playful spirit and luminous presence on screen. For a while, she seemed unstoppable, another silent star destined to carry her fame into the future. But Hollywood is ruthless with time. When sound arrived, not everyone made the leap. Marie's voice was fine, but the studios had already set their eyes on the next wave of starlets. She was pushed to the margins, offered roles that grew smaller, less glamorous, and increasingly unworthy of her talent. By the mid-1930s, the woman who had once been a headliner was fighting for scraps of work. Her family life offered little comfort. She was largely alone, with no partner or close relatives to pull her back when she began slipping. To cope with the rejection and loneliness, she turned to the only comfort she could find, and her health suffered as the years wore on. By the time she reached her late 30s, she was almost unrecognizable from the radiant beauty who had once charmed millions. When she died in 1937, it should have been a moment for remembrance, a chance to honor a career that had helped shape the industry's golden years. Instead, the press chose cruelty. Tabloids invented lurid details, printing lies that overshadowed the truth. For decades, her name was less associated with her films than with tasteless rumors about the way she was found. She was mocked, reduced to a punchline, stripped of dignity even after death. The real story is simpler and sadder. Marie Prevost was a woman left behind by the same system that had once celebrated her. She gave her youth, her beauty, and her charm to an industry that discarded her the moment she no longer fit its mold. And when she needed care, she was met with silence. She should be remembered not for the lies printed about her end, but for the joy she brought in the beginning. A star who burned bright, only to be forgotten while the lights still burned around her. Elizabeth Hartman, too delicate for the noise. Elizabeth Hartman never seemed like she belonged to the Hollywood machine. She had a softness that made her stand out in a business built on sharp edges. Her breakout role in A Patch of Blue earned her an Academy Award nomination and praise that most young actors only dream of. At 22, she was hailed as the next great star, sensitive, striking, unforgettable. But the very qualities that made her shine on screen made real life harder. She was delicate, sensitive to rejection, and uneasy with the constant demand for exposure. Hollywood isn't kind to people like that. The pressure to always be ready, always be glamorous, always be unshakable began to wear on her. Her family tried to understand, but they couldn't always reach her where she lived, inside her own thoughts, often clouded by worry. As the roles slowed, the quiet she once craved became isolating. Work gave her a sense of worth, and without it, the days grew heavier. She moved away from Los Angeles, away from the center of it all, searching for calm. But distance doesn't always heal. Her struggles followed her, settling deeper as the years went on. Friends remembered her as kind, warm, but always carrying a shadow. She married, hoping for stability, but the union didn't last. She lived with family at times, trying to find steadiness, but often drifted back into solitude. The industry that had once celebrated her seemed to forget her entirely, leaving her with memories of applause but no future roles to fill the silence. In 1987, the weight finally became too much. She left her home and ended her life by stepping from a fifth-floor window. She was only 43. The news barely made headlines. Hollywood had already moved on to brighter, louder names. Elizabeth Hartman's story is a reminder that talent and tenderness don't always survive in a world built on constant noise. She was too delicate for an industry that demands armor, and when the armor never came, the world simply stopped noticing her. Dana Plato. The price of growing up too fast. Dana Plato's childhood looked golden from the outside. At just 13, she landed the role of Kimberly Drummond on Different Strokes, one of the most popular sitcoms on television. To millions of viewers, she was the smiling daughter in a happy TV family. But real life behind the camera was very different. She grew up in an unstable home. Her parents divorced, and she was adopted by her mother and stepfather, who became her managers. Decisions about her career, her money, even her education weren't always hers to make. Hollywood had a way of treating child stars as investments, and Dana was no exception. She worked constantly, but the guidance she needed was never really there. By her late teens, she was struggling with the pressure of being both a public figure and a young woman who hadn't been allowed to grow at her own pace. The fame that once felt like a dream became a weight. She was written out of the show, her earnings were mismanaged, and she found herself adrift before she even turned 20. Dana tried to rebuild. She worked in small roles, made headlines she didn't want, and kept searching for a stability that never came. Her personal life was fragile, marked by strained relationships and financial hardship. When she had her son, Tyler, she poured herself into motherhood, but the cycle of instability never fully broke. In 1999, Dana's life ended in her motorhome at the age of 34. Just over a decade later, her son, who had carried the heavy legacy of her struggles, also ended his own life at 25. The story of one family became two generations of loss, tied together by unresolved pain. Dana Plato's story is not about scandal, though the tabloids painted it that way. It's about what happens when a child is pushed into a world too big for her, surrounded by people who took more than they gave. It's about the silence left when a young woman's light goes out, and the ache of knowing her son carried that silence too. Sal Mineo, the rebel who never escaped the shadows. Sal Mineo was only a teenager when fame found him. His role in Rebel Without a Cause put him alongside James Dean and Natalie Wood, and for a moment, he seemed destined for the same kind of immortality. He was nominated for an Academy Award, praised for his vulnerability on screen, and celebrated as one of Hollywood's brightest young talents. But early stardom can be a curse as much as a gift. Studios struggled to place him once he outgrew the teenage roles. He was handsome, intense, and willing to take risks, but the industry preferred safe, predictable leading men. For Sal, the path wasn't as smooth. Off-screen, he carried another struggle. Sal was a gay man at a time when being open about it meant losing everything. His family came from a strict background, and acceptance was hard to come by. So he lived in two parts, the public figure with a career to protect and the private man trying to build a life where he could be himself. That kind of division eats away at anyone. Still, Sal was bold in his art. He took roles that others turned down, explored theater, and kept pushing against the boundaries set for him. In many ways, he was ahead of his time, too honest, too unfiltered for an industry that wanted to keep its stars polished and mysterious. By the late 1970s, his career had slowed, but he was rebuilding. He returned to the stage, finding work that finally gave him the challenge he'd always craved. There was hope again, a sense that he was turning a corner. Then, in 1976, it ended violently. He was attacked near his home, and the loss shocked Hollywood. The details were muddled, a senseless crime, carried out quickly, leaving more questions than comfort. To the world, it was another tragedy. To those who knew him, it was unbearable. Sal Minio's life reminds us how fragile promise can be. He had the talent, the drive, the courage, but the world around him wasn't ready to let him live fully in the light. His brilliance remains, but so does the shadow he was forced to carry. Anissa Jones, the child who never got to grow up. For audiences of the late 1960s, Anissa Jones was Buffy from Family Affair, the little girl with pigtails, wide eyes, and a doll always tucked under her arm. On screen, she lived in a perfect world, a loving family, a glamorous home, endless smiles. But that world wasn't hers. It was a script, one that ended when the camera stopped. Behind the sweetness the public adored, Anissa's real childhood was unraveling. Her parents were divorced, locked in constant battles, and the weight of her earnings fell into the hands of adults who didn't always have her best interests at heart. She was earning money most kids couldn't imagine, yet she had little control over how it was spent. Fame made her valuable, but not protected. When Family Affair ended, Anissa was barely a teenager. The work that had once filled her days suddenly disappeared. Casting directors didn't know what to do with her, too old to play a child, too typecast to be seen as anything else. For Anissa, there was no normal life to return to. She had spent her formative years on a set, surrounded by adults who treated her as a product. Without the show, there was only silence. Her family situation grew worse. She bounced between her mother and father, caught in a tug-of-war that left her feeling like a burden rather than a daughter. The same studios that had once relied on her charm now had no place for her. The world that had made her famous simply walked away. By the time she reached her late teens, Anissa was lost. With no guidance, no stable home, and no future mapped out, she slipped further from the promise of her early years. In 1976, at just 18, she was gone. The little girl who had once brought joy to millions never had the chance to find her own. Anissa Jones's story isn't just about a young life ending too soon. It's about a system that takes childhood, sells it to audiences, and leaves the child behind once the show is over. She was never given the chance to grow up on her own terms, and that was the real tragedy. Carol Landis, the girl they called the Blonde Bomber. Carol Landis had the kind of beauty that Hollywood adored. Nicknamed the Blonde Bomber, she lit up the screen in the 1940s with musicals, comedies, and wartime morale boosters. She was vivacious, radiant, and seemingly untouchable, the type of actress who could walk into a studio lot and have every head turn. To the public, she embodied Hollywood's golden promise. But behind the glamour, Carol's life was far less perfect. She came from a difficult childhood marked by poverty and instability. Stardom gave her an escape, but it didn't erase the feelings of being unwanted and unseen that followed her into adulthood. She threw herself into her work, but when the industry began to cool on her, she sought solace in love. Carol was a romantic at heart, and she fell deeply, often recklessly. Her marriages were numerous and often unhappy, each leaving her more bruised than the last. When she became involved with actor Rex Harrison, she believed she had finally found the lasting connection she longed for. But Harrison was married, and his promises of leaving his wife never materialized. Carol's devotion turned to despair as she realized the future she hoped for would never come. On July 5, 1948, Carol's housekeeper found her in her Los Angeles home. She had left notes behind, one for her mother and one for Harrison. She was only 29 years old. Her death stunned Hollywood, a star so luminous, gone so suddenly. The press focused on the scandal, the affair, the messy details, while her family was left with the ache of knowing how much she had longed for stability and never truly found it. Carol Landis should be remembered for more than her tragic end. She entertained soldiers overseas during the war, gave warmth to audiences during a difficult decade, and embodied a kind of golden Hollywood optimism. But she was also a woman who wanted more than fame. She wanted lasting love, belonging, and peace. In the end, Hollywood could give her everything but that. As we look back at these stories, it's impossible not to feel the weight of them. Each name carried a dream, a spark, a hope for something brighter than the world they came from. For a while, the screen caught their light. Audiences laughed with them, cried with them, admired their beauty, and repeated their lines. But when the applause faded, too many of them were left to face their struggles in silence. Some were forgotten before their lives even ended. Others were remembered not for their talent, but for the way they left us. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, when a person's humanity is lost beneath a headline. It's important to remember that these were not just stars, not just characters trapped on celluloid. They were daughters, sons, parents, friends. They were people who carried fears and dreams, who stumbled and fought, who wanted to be loved and understood just like any of us. Hollywood had a way of building people up to impossible heights and then walking away when they could no longer shine. But here, telling their stories, we give them back a little of what was taken: dignity, empathy, and remembrance. And now it's your turn. These stories don't live only in the past. They live on when we talk about them, when we share them, when we see the humanity behind the glamour. So I'd love to hear from you. Which of these stories touched you the most? Which one surprised you or made you think differently about the people behind the names? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. If this video spoke to you, if you believe these lives deserve to be remembered with compassion, I invite you to support this channel. A like lets others find these stories. A comment gives them more weight. A subscription means you'll be here when we uncover more untold histories, more voices that deserve to be heard. It may seem small, but every action you take helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with an open heart. In a world that often forgets, your presence makes remembering possible.